Well, hello, everybody. I'm John O'Loughlin, and welcome to McDuff Lives, McDuff Lives 1 and McDuff Lives 3, and also McDuff on Facebook. And we are so happy to have once again with us Harley Schlanger back for a report. And that I hope you had a chance to watch his daily briefing this morning. I think it's very important. And we need to really take heed to what Harley is saying about restoring the American system. And the American system of economy was working just fine until some people from overseas decided to kind of mess it up. Is that a fair statement, Harley?
That's a fair statement. I mean, they have tinkered with it and attacked it ever since the time of the American Revolution. And we've had periods of great success. The Hamiltonian First National Bank, for example, we paid off the Revolutionary War debt and began the process of making the United States an integrated economy with industrial capability, manufacturing, agriculture. We had to revive it again after the Civil War with Lincoln, who used the greenback policy to ignite what you might call a second industrial revolution. FDR had to intervene at the point at which the private banks had pretty much bankrupted the United States. And he had a plan at the end of the war with his Bretton Woods proposal to ensure that the American system, rather than the British system, would be the only game in town. Unfortunately, he died. Truman came under the influence of Churchill. Eisenhower did a little bit to fight back against it. Kennedy was moving in a major way to restore the American system. And since he was assassinated, we've had a string of, at best, mediocre presidents and some absolute traitors who have subverted the American system. And I just got this figure from an email a few minutes ago. The Atlanta Federal Reserve has now revised their GDP standard or GDP forecast for the second quarter to minus 2.1%, the great Biden economic recovery. So, we've lost a lot of ground, but we still have a system that functions if the principles are adhered to. And that's what we're calling for us to get back to.
I guess 2 or 3 years ago, I was a site called Deagle, Deagle, caught my attention because it purported to give projections of things like future population, but more importantly, future economic status. And it had the United States really taking a nosedive, as both in population and in economic status, to really shock me, if you could believe those figures. But I think most people thought, well, that's just propaganda and it's not real. And it kind of drifted away from the radar screen. However, when you mention that we're going into a period of actual negative growth, if that's not an oxymoron, um, it's it's kind of confirming the suspicions, if not the exact figures, but the idea not only that this is going to happen because of various disasters that have made it unavoidable. No, but because of the intentional acts of some people behind the scenes that have been operating uh, uh, behind the scenes with impunity. And that these are, I think, I submit, the same people that have been subverting the American system all along, just in the most current fashion. They are now seeing some success in bringing us down. Uh, in other words, this is not just the hidden hand of Adam Smith. There's actual people with hands on levers pulling them, in my opinion. So I leave that to you. What do you think?
Well, the hidden hand is the one that's picking your pocket, or the invisible hand, as Smith called it.
Hmm.
No, you're absolutely right. But the problem most people have with this is when they hear there might be a crash or we're declining economically, they look at it day to day, week to week. Lyndon LaRouche has been looking at this thing as a series of cycles, a series of changes, transformations that have occurred, especially since 1963 and the assassination of Kennedy. but then it went on into full bore after the 1971 August 15th decision by Richard Nixon to essentially put an end to the Bretton Woods system of fixed exchange rates, reserve, gold standard, gold reserve, I should say, backing up the dollar and so on. But even so, there was enough of an industrial economy from World War II, from the NASA period, even including the various war buildups, Vietnam, the Reagan defense buildup, that there was still an economy that was part of that, which was able to survive the periodic indiscretions by people like Paul Volcker and Alan Greenspan. However, the trend as a whole, the arc as a whole, has been toward deindustrialization, privatization, deregulation, the hallmark of neoliberal economic policy, which they present as true freedom, that you're free to use your money in whatever way you can to maximize your profit, even if that has negative effects for the whole economy. Now, that's not the American system. The American system was not designed as a get-rich-quick scheme for people who already have assets and money. It was designed as a system that could take creative potential and transform it into improvements in the living standards for growing numbers of people. And when we've had that approach, it's worked beautifully. And that's when LaRouche talks about the American system, when I talk about the American system, that's what we're talking about. And the idea that some people have, they say, well, America's great because you can make a fortune. Well, the question is, how do you make that fortune? You can make a fortune from drug running and running whorehouses. That's not something that's healthy for the economy. What's healthy for the economy is those infusions of credit into frontier technologies, research and development, scientific advances, which increase the productivity of every person employed in the labor force. That's how you create real wealth. We haven't been doing that, and we've been doing it less and less over the period from 1971 to the present. So what we're seeing today is what LaRouche warned about, a systemic decline of the industrial, manufacturing, agricultural, infrastructure investment required to allow for those increases in productivity, and instead increases in financial aggregates and monetary aggregates, which, while they may make some billionaires, detract and subvert from the American system of physical economy overall. And that's what we've been trying to get across recently. And it's interesting because we now see two completely different systems. The British system is the transatlantic policy. It's the International Monetary Fund. It's the European Union. It's the G7. On the other side, we see the BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Belt and Road Initiative. We see countries that are adopting elements of the American system that are not only growing their economy, but growing the economies of their neighbors. So you have this radical division. And unfortunately, we have almost no one in the United States with the courage to address that. Almost no one who actually understands it well enough to address it. But those who do understand it are afraid of what would be said of them if they spoke in these terms. And the advantage we do have is that Lyndon LaRouche was never afraid to tell the truth, never afraid to take risks in making forecasts. And most of his forecasts have been proven to be accurate, including his warning in the late 1980s that if the US went on to continue this idea of the neoconservatives, of a unipolar military power to impose a world economic system, that ultimately we wouldn't have the capability even to sustain the military power. And we're seeing that now with the outcome of what's going on in Ukraine and what we saw in Afghanistan. And by the way, the Marine Corps just announced they can't recruit enough able-bodied, mentally capable people to fulfill their quotas, which is part of this decline of productivity and creativity in the American population.
That sounds like suspiciously sounds like what was called the Mavni program, the importation of foreigners who had military skills in the case that there was an insurrection. Military assets vital in case of insurrection, or something like that. Mavni, which George Webb was reporting on a couple years back. And when you can say, well, in the United States, we don't have sufficient intelligence in our population to hire them as Marines. I don't believe it. I think that's ridiculous. I think, of course, we do. In World War II, they didn't have any trouble finding soldiers and Marines, and somehow or another, they were able to voluntarily or otherwise put them to work as soldiers. And
big difference though, John. World War II, we had a leader as a president, and we had a clear mission. In the last 30 years, these years of regime change wars, of overturning governments, of intervening in defense of colonial regimes, we no longer have the moral standing. And that's reflected in the general population. Most Americans don't think we should be committing ourselves to a new war, especially after the wars in Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan. So, and the president is not making the case for that. This idea that we're just going to provide the material so that the Ukrainians can fight the war. Well, I think even with the lies in the media, people can see Ukraine is not doing very well in this war. And in fact, the question is, will they run out of ammunition before they run out of soldiers? Now, the other thing, I'm not familiar with this Mavni program, but I am familiar with things like Blackwater. You know, the idea of mercenary armies recruiting former or military veterans to be deployed overseas. Several of them were caught recently in Ukraine. The informal CIA, you might say, although in some cases they work directly with the CIA. But you know, the reports from the Marine Corps were really quite something in terms of the inability of people to qualify on the grounds of understanding history, understanding geography, even be able to add that the standard of education has fallen dramatically. And I think some of this has to do with the whole social media age, the internet, and by internet I mean really texting and Instagram, but the lack of a grounding in this idea that LaRouche used to call the morality of production. That if you're producing something of value, it gives you a sense of purpose. If all you're doing is trading funny money, and that's your sense of purpose, you lose the moral fiber of the nation. I've just been rereading a book I read years ago, The Bonfire of the Vanities, by Tom Wolfe.
Wow.
Which takes up this question of what is the mentality of people on Wall Street? The idea that they're masters of the universe who can do whatever they want, and meanwhile they look down on the average person. They're imbued with a kind of sense of privilege. They're not going to fight the wars. Who's going to fight these wars? Who's going to build the infrastructure in the United States? The Chinese are doing that. The Africans are doing that now. The South Americans want to do it. But we can't come up with enough money to fix tunnels and bridges in the United States. So this is really the decline of an era. And whatever you want to call it, this is something that was forecast by LaRouche back in the 70s, again in the 80s. At the time of the fall of the Soviet Union, he said that America is going in the same direction. And I don't remember, I don't think I reported this to you because I wasn't on last week, but there are a series of articles being put out in the British defense journals about how the British lack the capability to gear up the production of ammunition. Not only do they not have the military factories, they don't have the industrial base to transform for military production. And so the new defense or the new Army Chief of Staff is saying the Brits have to be prepared to fight a land war in Europe. And the people who actually know these things say, we can't put together a platoon to go out and even match the existing standards of NATO, much less equip them. NATO's running out of weapons. And the more they send to Ukraine, the more they're ending up turned into scrap by Russian missiles. So it's really the warnings of LaRouche are being borne out on the battlefield and in the industrial plants and the unemployment centers and the schools of the United States.
I have, just gained so much from studying, the work of Lyndon LaRouche, and I really commend it to everyone, especially what Harley was just talking about, that from basic his understanding of economics, so he could predict what's happening now, and uh, whether that is the inevitable result of some things that were done some time ago. I think it's also the intentional result of people like President Biden, who we think is going to protect us from this type of economic sabotage, but in fact is letting it happen, is opening the gates and letting the horses out of the barn, and everything is going down very quickly as our inflation goes up. And I think it's worse in Europe right now than it is here. But nevertheless, one of the big things that frightens me is the idea of driving the trucking industry out of business by increasing the cost of diesel fuel. And so that, that can create some chaos if somebody needed to have a little chaos to make some ordo ab chaos from. And I really do, I do think we have to stop. Well, at least in my view, and I know that this is controversial, but I think we have to tell people this is intentional. Because if
Well,
we just tell them, look, don't let it go any further because it's dangerous, then they tend to think, well, we've got smart people on the top and they'll figure it out and they'll steer us away from the cliff and we won't go over the waterfall like these doomsayers are saying. Most people are willing to just keep betting on the experts, quote unquote, and that scares me.
well, when you talk about intentional, it's clear if you go back to the 50s, you'll see what some people called a brain trust emerging around the Rockefellers, promoting anti-growth. Now, here's the irony. The Rockefellers made their money through oil, Standard Oil, the conniving they did with the rail to transport their oil, the pipelines they built, and so on. But they became radical environmentalists. Lawrence Rockefeller, John D. Rockefeller III, the population council that they set up. And they were putting into practice this idea of lowering the energy flux density of the systems that produce electricity in the United States. Now, that was intentional. And what was their goal? Was it to make more money? Well, actually not. It was to reduce population, because their view was that the population of the world was expanding too rapidly for the resource base, and therefore it's got to stop. This became part of US policy by a former Rockefeller employee named Henry Kissinger, when, as Secretary of State, he pushed through the National Security Study Memo 200, which identified population growth in mostly developing third world countries in Africa, in South America, and in Asia as a threat to the United States, as a strategic threat to the United States. So that's one element of it. Then you have bankers such as Walt Wriston, who wrote a book called The Twilight of Sovereignty. And what Wriston argues in this book is that sovereign nations have constitutions and representative forms of government that respond to the needs of their constituents. But we can no longer do that, because if we do it, we're going to use up all the raw materials on the planet. So therefore, we have to do away with sovereignty and have a top-down control. What Bush Sr. called the New World Order. So it's very easy to point out that there were people articulating these ideas and policies, not just buffoons like Klaus Schwab, who's really just a paid mouthpiece for this, but the oligarchs who write the script for them. The Atlantic Council, for example, with Frederick Kemp, who does a column every week about how we're destroying Russia and Ukraine. The Atlantic Council is funded by the British government. It's funded by the same corporate cartels that fund the think tanks. So there is an intent behind this. The Club of Rome is another early example from the late 1960s. Aurelio Peccei, who's an Italian oligarch, who worked together with people who produced imbeciles like Mario Draghi, the current prime minister of Italy, who is nothing but a functionary of the city of London, as was proven when his picture was taken on the yacht Britannia in the early 1990s when they were planning the demise of the Italian Republic. Now he's the prime minister of Italy and a top figure in the European Union. Ursula von der Leyen, who comes from the Albrecht family in Germany, which is an old noble family. So these are people who are not just liars or ignorant. They're people who, as you say, John, have an intention. Now, the good thing is they're not that smart. Their intentions aren't going to really work. There was an article from LaRouche in 2011 who said that ultimately the only way to sustain the unipolar order is to provoke Russia into a war which they lose, to defeat them as a potential opposition. And he went on to say that then they could go ahead and write off the hundreds of trillions of dollars of debt that they're holding without a real loss, because they'd be the ones who'd be able to reprint the money to take over whatever is of real physical wealth on the planet. And we see that going on with Bill Gates, for example, buying up farmland, BlackRock buying up farmland. They're already moving into that. So yeah, there is an intent. It won't work if the American people and the people of Western Europe learn the lesson of what this fight is about right now. Because what we see is intelligent people in the global South, the developing sector, who are saying, no, we're not going along with this. And that's what the BRICS, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, they may include as new members Saudi Arabia in the very near future, Indonesia. The group that met while the G7 was meeting, there was another group meeting, which was the BRICS Plus, which represents about twice the population of the G7 countries and almost the same GDP. So there's a monumental shift underway. And by the way, their GDP is based on physical goods production, not debt collection that they can use military to squeeze out of countries. So I think, if you really want to forecast, if the Western system were left alone to do what it wants to do, it will collapse, and it will be put out of its misery by countries refusing to bail it out in the future. And there's a new system developing, which is coming out of Eurasia, coming out of China, coming out of South Africa, even Brazil. Bolsonaro is beginning to move in coordination with this. Mexico, we'll see who else. But, people who think there's some smart group that has figured it out and knows what to do, the ones who actually have a plan are the evil ones. Right. And the ones who might be good don't have a plan. And if they do have a plan, they're pessimistic. They don't think it can succeed. And they won't work with the people internationally who can help them succeed in defeating this transatlantic oligarchy.
You use the word evil, and I think that's a very, very accurate term. However, on their side, they don't see themselves as evil. I think their philosophy is very well expressed through the eugenicists. And in that, they perceive that there are different grades of humanity, and some humans are better than other humans. And uh, the idea that the world is overpopulated is easily debunked by simple mathematics, but they cling to it. That's one of the things that they have to believe in order to believe in their system. And their system is the pure empiricism that you and your colleagues have described so well of the British Empire as developed in the 19th century. And now we have populations that are completely ignorant of the fact that all this stuff has been going on for a long, long time. And they are setting up countries to fail. They are setting up populations to starve. Look at the famines around the world, and
Yeah.
in Afghanistan. And well, I once again believe that it's not it's not going to win this if we say, hey, we're good and they're evil. I think we have to go beyond that and to say, look, this is a system. It's the Fabian system or whatever you want to call it, but identify it as a false belief that is akin to a religion for those people. And that's where
Mhm.
you get the attraction of the satanic movements. These Michael Aquinos and this you know putting statues of Baphomet places and inducing children to follow that. This is the battle of spirituality, as St. Paul would say. And here we are fighting against these spiritual demons, whether you believe in them or not. It's not enough to say that they're evil. We've got to say, look, this is not just people having bad thoughts on a certain day, or evil, like fanatic evil, like the evil Hitler or the evil Stalin or the evil Napoleon, or name your evil guy. This is a ongoing program that has not been revealed to the people of the world, and that's what I think we have to do.
Well, and there's no other term for it than evil. Whatever they think they're doing, they know that people are dying because of their policies.
Hmm.
They do have enough strategic intelligence to know that if you withhold money from Afghanistan that belongs to Afghanistan and you put sanctions on them because you don't like the Taliban, then there's not enough food there, especially in the winter months. And so, what are you doing? You're
We lost our connection with Harley. See if he comes back. Well, technical issues right now. We're waiting for Harley to maybe reconnect. I think his internet probably failed him. Well, let me check in with the chat while we're waiting to hear from Harley. And the lizard people believe they are a superior race and the custodians of the world, says Dow 221. Yeah. I think, that's interesting that we talk about this idea of the lizard people. Um, you may have seen back when what's her name, Lady Gaga, was supposed that she was with Prince Charles, and Prince Charles suddenly, turns into this big dragon character, uh, just to demonstrate that he could do that, a shape shifting Prince Charles. And I don't believe that. I think that's hype that they send out, to scare us or make us, somehow believe that maybe this could happen. On the other hand, I do think that everybody has a lizard brain, and the amygdala, right? And I think that this idea of tuning into your amygdala, your lizard brain, and then drawing you into that mentality of, fight or flight, uh, kill or run, or just devour and enjoy devouring. And this is the lizard brain theory of how to subvert people, how to subvert us is to take away our reasoning abilities and turn us back into self-interested and non-intellectual creatures. That's what I think this lizard thing is about. Um, maybe their blue blood is really because they have copper in their veins. I don't know. That's an interesting idea too. That I have to have some kind of proof myself when I discuss these things. Let me see if there's anything I can do behind the scenes here. Let me check my email and see anything going on. Hmm. Artemir Lazarus, hello. You say the history of Pythagoras was taught in Babylon and was held captive in Egypt or something. Started his own cult. Okay. Well, yeah, Pythagoras is an important figure in the Freemasonic idea of, cosmology, if you want to put it that way. And he's really one of those numbers persons that wants to see everything before he will believe it. And the absence of value to spiritual things is part of that tradition. Michael Panzer says, what more do I have to do to convince you about the reptoids? Well, if you could film an interview with one, and show it to me on YouTube, I think I might believe it. So set it up. CERN, what is going on at CERN? I don't know. I used to try to figure out what's going on at CERN. They have that Hindu Kali Shiva image, out in front, which is kind of spooky. The idea of, getting in touch with the Kali, and what is it called? The Kali Yerga, the time of darkness and evil things. Right in front of the CERN thing. I also um, think there's a lot of psyop going on with the CERN thing. Just, of course, the St. Gallen Tunnel video. If you haven't seen that, you got to see it. They've got supposedly all the employees of CERN out in these outlandish satanic type scenes with goats and goat heads and people dancing in rhythm to wearing orange jumpsuits. I mean, I can't remember all the gory details, but if you look at it, you'll see that there's a massive psyop around the CERN thing. And whether they're looking for the tiniest particle of the tiniest particle, which they may be, I think they also are amassing the greatest computing power that's ever been put together, and that's going to maybe be the massive computer for the matrix that they're fashioning for all of us when we get confined to our little cubicles and hooked up to their big computer. Let's see. Andra Morris Ellis, I still believe there is a way we awakened ones can transmute the darkness of their choices. As you and Harley just said, they see what they are doing and seem not to care. Yeah, they're like Remember Richard Dawkins, right? The guy that says there is no God, and he puts it very, very bluntly. He says, "I don't need a God. I don't have a need for a God. I can explain the universe, and as a scientist, without a God. So why do I need a God?" And a lot of people are attracted to that idea because the idea of God as marketed to us or is taught to us as children is not a very attractive God, you know? The God of the God of bad or good, you know? Like Santa Claus, you gotta be sure you're good because if you aren't good, you'll get a lump of coal and an old sticks in your stocking instead of something that the other children will get, and you'll feel terrible because you were bad. So you must be bad, must be good. And that idea of God, Santa Claus, similar idea of a punishing God that you need to be afraid of, and you need to do what you're told. You need to kneel. You need to, go to First Communion, or you need to go to Bible study, or you have to, uh, you know, pr- do whatever it is in your religion your family brought you up in order to make sure you submit yourself to the will of God. And that, I think, is not a bad idea, but the problem is the marketing of this God is really bad. So those of us that kind of that kind of didn't really buy it during school, but because everybody else was doing it, it seemed like, well, yeah, okay. And I went to a Catholic high school, and I don't think most of the boys there were really all that into the religion. They were just there because hopefully they were going to get a better education, or their parents thought so, or maybe they had discipline problems, which a lot of us did. Not me, though. I was a good boy. Oh, Harley's back. Oh, cool. And there he is. We have a Harley Schlanger back. I don't know what happened, but these things do happen on the internet. So thank you for persevering, Harley, and welcome back to the show.
I'm on my other computer now, but what happened was I lost the internet on the computer just as we were talking about satanic evil.
Uh-huh. How did that happen? It's a
I,
coincidence of
I think
some.
that's happened to us before, John.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Boy, that reminds me of the first time that I really realized that they're really scrutinizing me. And I mean uh, the British intelligence in particular was a show I did on the 2012 London Olympics, the opening ceremony to that one, and that was the one where they basically presented an epidemic. Uh, the whole they had dance numbers with hospital beds and sick children in the beds, and then toward the end of that particular scene, along comes this big pop-up clown that pops up like this, out like a Jack in the Box out of the box, and it's this big, grotesquely wide-faced guy with blonde hair looking out, and he comes along, and then the virus starts to go away. And I was, and right as I started talking about the HRHs, right? You know who I mean. Um,
Mhm.
Immediately, my show just went down. It wasn't like they censored it later. It was like, boom, I was off the air, and and that tells me, that they definitely are watching me. But I think it's worth everybody's while to go back and watch the opening ceremony of the 2012 London Olympics. And if you don't pick up the message there that there's going to be a pandemic and Boris Johnson is going to pop out of, the box and save everybody, then, I think you really need to watch it.
Well, it also shows how they miscalculated because Boris Johnson has been an abject failure in virtually everything he's done. There's an article by Kit Clarenberg, who I think you may know from, he writes for The Intercept and also for the Gray Zone. He did an article on what he called a very British coup, how Theresa May was dumped to bring in Boris Johnson. And he makes the point that it was a group of insiders led by Sir Richard Dearloffe, the former director of MI6, that was behind this coup. And they did so because they thought Johnson would be able to cement the special relationship with the United States. And at the end of the article, he writes that now they've concluded that Johnson is not capable of doing that, and that the same people who brought him in are preparing to dump him. And if you're following closely, every day there's a new scandal involving Boris Johnson and how untrustworthy he is, how conservatives are losing by-elections. And the most recent thing that Kit Clarenberg wrote is that the group of people who are behind bringing Johnson in are now settling on Liz Truss, who is the foreign secretary, who is the leading war hawk in Britain in terms of continuing the death of Ukrainians as battering rams against Russia. So, it's quite interesting. In any case, when I was talking about this on another program recently, as soon as I brought up this question of the role of the British insiders and Sir Richard Dearloffe, my internet went down then also. Now, I used to have a systematic problem with the internet, but it's been fixed. It's been much, much better. So I'm concluding there is some definite targeting going on.
Seriously. And, all around the world to people of people, different political stripes. It's just a matter of if you mention something that, you can't mention,
Well, let me give you an example, a really interesting one. There was a debate that took place in China the other day, which included the ambassadors from France, the United Kingdom, the US, and Russia talking about Ukraine. And in it, the US ambassador, who's Nicholas Burns, attacked the Chinese by saying that they should stop supporting Russia. Russia's lying. Russia provoked the war in Ukraine. Russia's a terrible country. And then the Russian ambassador gave a very thorough and competent rebuttal of that. The Newsweek story on it, the New York Times story on it, the Reuters story on it said nothing about the Russian ambassador's intervention. So it was left hanging that Nicholas Burns's attack on Russia was definitive and accepted. So, it doesn't matter whether you and I are talking before a few hundred or a few thousand people, or whether the Russian ambassador is addressing an audience of millions in China. They'll black it out. They'll do whatever they can to keep the actual story from interfering with the lying narratives that they need to keep people in the dark and willing to go along with this, with their policies, their unipolar policies.
I've been enjoying a writer named who goes by Edward Slavsquat, which is a kind of a Russian joke of a name. His real name is Riley Wagaman, and he prints his work on Substack. And he lives in Moscow. He's an American who lived in Czechoslovakia for a long time and then spent a little time in Ukraine, actually. And now he's living in Moscow and reporting from there. And the stuff that he writes seems to be not censored at all. It's one of the most amazing things to just realize that there's people in Moscow that are criticizing Putin right and left. I mean, severely. And they're allowed to print their stuff. But in this country, we can't. There's so many things that we can't say. And I think it's also true in most of Europe now. And doesn't that scare people?
In Australia, they're silencing people. In France, Le Monde did a story the other day which quoted a blogger who has been in Donetsk, talking about what it was like living there with the shelling coming from the Ukrainian army up until the time of the special military launch by Putin. And it was in the first edition of Le Monde, and then it was dropped from the rest of the editions. And she was her connection, her internet connection from uh, somewhere in the Donbass has been cut since then. So, the censorship. I mean, here, John, this is so ironic. We talk about democracy versus autocracy. And as you point out, there's more democracy in Moscow now than there is in the West. Look what Zelensky just did. After having shut down all opposition parties, they're now arresting opposition figures. They're confiscating their bank accounts. They're doing everything possible to silence the opposition. And the opposition is growing because many of the people in the Ukrainian army are now protesting that they were sent out with inadequate training, with inadequate lines of communication, sent out to die. And when they raise that as an issue, they're arrested. So, the fight for freedom in Ukraine is certainly not the fight to defend Zelensky, because he's much more autocratic than anything Putin is alleged to be doing.
I follow some of the military reporters, and it's often said that the general of the UPA, the Ukraine, I mean the UA, whatever, the Ukrainian army, says to Zelensky, says, "Hey, can I withdraw from here? We're starting to get a little looking like we might get surrounded. Can we please, back? Can we pull back? No, you can't pull back." And then, so the general is asking the president of the country, but the president of the country, who should go along with what the general said, can't do it because he's a puppet of people that are pulling his strings, and he has to do what they say. And this is where you get into the dark side of criminal and CIA influences, and the will of these people who actually are of a Nazi mentality. To maybe Zelensky's not, but he is.
He's captive by them.
Right.
And the NATO summit in Madrid released this new NATO strategic concept. And I was talking to a German military officer who was talking to some of his American colleagues, and they were saying this is a war doctrine. NATO was supposed to be a defense institution to defend Europe from Soviet aggression. This is now a strategic concept that's committed to provocations up to and into war. And, this was presented as the great highlight of the unity of the democracies that met at Madrid. Now, there's a lot of dissension emerging. The grandson of Charles de Gaulle, Pierre de Gaulle, has written a couple of very interesting and insightful reports to the French military general staff, basically saying, now is the time to pull out of the NATO integrated command, as my grandfather did, for the same reason, that you're being pushed to the point where you're going to have to participate in a nuclear war on the expectation that if Paris is about to be hit, Washington will come to your defense. And he said, it wasn't true then, it's not true now. What did we not learn from Afghanistan? What are we not learning from Ukraine? So I think there's a great deal of open fissures starting to occur now within the NATO command, within the Northern Europe. The whole question of Sweden and Finland is still unsettled. And you asked about Europe. I mean, there are farmers on strike in France, in Italy. There are truckers on strike all over the continent. There's probably going to be a general strike in the United Kingdom. And in Germany, there's a report that if the Russians do shut off the gas, which they very well could at any point, the German economy will collapse by 13.9% within 6 months. If you go with the full green policy, and the economics minister is Robert Habeck, who's one of the most crazy ideologues among the Green Party people, Habeck is privately saying this war is the best thing ever because we're finally going to get out from under fossil fuel, coal, nuclear, all the bad electricity production. And he said he admitted that the replacement LNG from the United States couldn't get there before 2024 because the containerized ports and the pipelines are not there. And then someone said, well, why don't we just nationalize the Nord Stream 2? So here we have the so-called rules-based order stealing the pipeline that was constructed by private companies and the Russian government. So they haven't done it yet, but they're talking about it. That's where you see the insanity. Now, we're at a point where gas prices continue to go up. Habeck put the country on the second level of alert, which is one level away from rationing gasoline at the pump, meaning you'll only be able to get a certain amount of gasoline per month. They may even hand out coupons or stickers or something to show that you're eligible to get gasoline. They're talking about the big chemical company BASF shutting down 25 to 30% of its operation, which is over 100,000 jobs. The auto sector, they're now saying we're going to definitely be out of the internal combustion engine by 2035, regardless of whether electric vehicles can fill the gap and whether people can afford them or not. So you see the dictatorial policies that are coming from green ideologues who deep down truly believe that they're doing this to save the world from overpopulation. Or if they don't believe that, they believe that their type is better equipped to govern than people who are, well, what did Hillary call them? The not undesirables, but well, anyway, that's how the Greens look at most of the population.
Useless eaters.
Well, yeah, useless eaters. That's what the Nazis called them. Or Untermenschen, which is how the Nazis referred to the Russians. So this is where eugenics does come in. This is where the real nature of fascism, Shaktian fascism, you can't separate that from the actual fascist policy of the Nazis. And it wasn't just anti-Semitism. It was anti-human. You know, they did kill 27 million Russians. They did conduct ethnic cleansing in every country they went into. And the Ukrainian Nazis were killing Romanians, Poles, you know, they're great Polish allies. In Lvov and Western Ukraine, they conducted massacres of Polish and Jewish citizens. So this is Shaktian fascism. And it's the cover for it is Russia's totalitarian, and the earth is going to melt because of global warming.
Well, trying to put all this together, it seems to me that what I'm looking for really is a simple way to explain to people why they would want to take the United States down. Because most people think, hey, we're the most productive country. We have the highest standard of living. Everybody wants to come here, and look at we're all doing great. So why in the world would the people that have profited by building this country up want to just tear it down? And it's the hardest thing to get past that. I think what my feeling from our talk this morning leaves me thinking this, that because of the ability of the American people under its Constitution to resist the totalitarian fascist state that they're trying to impose on the rest of the world, that they have had to withdraw their economic support from us in order to crash us so that we become compliant, so that we no longer insist upon our individual rights and are willing to give them up. And, you know, along with that, I see the strategy of tension, the Gladio tension, once again, with shootings in Chicago, broadcast all over the nation, that they are once again engaging in that type of terrorism against their own, or supposedly, our own citizens, in order to maintain control over us while they take us down. That, I'm afraid, is the way I see it right now.
Well, they're also using the polarization around Roe versus Wade. They're using the polarization around the January 6th investigation, which is not really an investigation because there's a whole lot of things they never investigated. Like, what was the role of the FBI in this whole situation? Who
Yeah.
was it who told the security forces to let people into the Capitol building? There's a whole lot. There may well be some malfeasance from the people who are storming the Capitol, but where did that come from? Who is organizing it? It wasn't just Donald Trump telling them to go and assert their rights. There is evidence that there were people in the Proud Boys and others who were FBI plants. That's not coming up in the hearings. And so what they're doing is they're creating these artificial divisions of left, right, liberal, conservative, red, blue, and so on, to keep people from recognizing that what we've been talking about, there are people carrying out policies that are destroying lives, and no one's discussing it. No one's willing to name the names or point the fingers, talk about the Federal Reserve role, talk about the role of the Congress passing legislation that gives more power to the Fed, and so on. So I think these are the things that it's not so easy to make the point you're talking about, John, but people can figure it out, and we've just got to keep emphasizing it.
Well, that's what we shall do. And once again, I find myself after a show with you, Harley, just having to meditate for a while, because there's so many good things have come together for me, and I'm really grateful to you for committing yourself to our shows that we've been doing now for probably a year and a half. And we wish you well over there. How's your son, the musician, coming along on his
He's
violin?
doing pretty well. He's switched to piano now, so he's doing very well with the piano, and he's very happy about it. And he's starting to compose, so he's trying to make himself into a little Mozart, which I think is a little pretentious, but I'm encouraging it.
Why not? I mean, dreams, and but I'm so glad to hear it, and thank you so much once again, Harley Schlanger from Potsdam, Germany, for joining us with an update. And be sure and follow Harley's work at the Schiller Institute.com and at LaRoucheOrganization.com.
Well, thank you, John. I'll talk to you soon.
All right, let's send you off with the eagle, with the